What most people misunderstand about an empath is that their breaking point doesn't look like a breaking point at all. There's no dramatic outburst, no final argument where everything from most people. They don't immediately react to that signal. They don't jump to conclusions or walk away at the first sign of imbalance. Instead, they compensate. They lean in. Further, they give more, not less. Psychologically, this comes from a belief system rooted in connection that if something feels off, the solution is to increase understanding, increase effort, increase presence. So they start adjusting themselves. They communicate more clearly. They become more patient. They try to anticipate needs before they're even spoken. And from the outside, it can look like everything is fine or even improving, but internally, something very different is happening. There's a quiet calculation taking place. Every time their effort isn't reciprocated, it registers. Every time their emotional presence is met with indifference, it leaves an imprint. And unlike someone who reacts impulsively, the empath observes. They collect data. They begin to recognize patterns. And this is where the shift begins, not emotionally at first, but cognitively. They start asking questions they weren't asking before. Why am I the only one trying this hard? Why do I feel drained? After every interaction, why does this connection feel one-sided? These aren't emotional outbursts. These are evaluations. And once an empath moves into evaluation mode, the dynamic has already started to change, because awareness alters behavior. At this stage, they don't confront immediately. They don't accuse. They don't demand. What they do instead is subtle. They begin to withdraw their excess energy. Not all at once, but gradually. The long messages become shorter. The constant availability becomes selective. The emotional labor they once gave freely starts to decline. And here's the critical mistake most people make. They interpret this as the empath changing or pulling away for no reason. But in reality, this is not a reaction, it's a response to a pattern that has gone unaddressed for too long. Neglect teaches the empath something very specific. It teaches them that their presence is not required in the way they once believed it was. And once that belief shifts, their behavior follows naturally. There's also a deeper philosophical layer to this. Empaths operate with an internal principle of reciprocity, not in a transactional sense, but in an energetic one. They believe that attention, care, and emotional presence should move in both directions. When that flow is consistently blocked, it creates a form of psychological dissonance. And human beings are wired to resolve dissonance, either by changing the situation or by removing themselves from it. Empaths tend to choose the latter, but only after exhausting the former. They will try to fix what's broken long before they decide to leave it. But once they reach the point where the evidence is undeniable that their effort is not being matched, that their presence is not being valued, they don't see a reason to keep negotiating with a reality that has already revealed its truth. And this is where the disappearance begins, not as an act of punishment, not as a strategy to provoke a reaction, but as a form of alignment. Their internal world finally matches their external behavior. If they are not valued, they stop placing themselves in spaces where that truth is reinforced. What makes this so powerful and often so confusing for others is the absence of noise. There's no dramatic exit, no final explanation that ties everything together. Because from the empath's perspective, the explanation has already been given, not in words, but in patterns that were consistently ignored. By the time they leave, they've already processed the loss. They've already grieved the connection. What looks like a sudden disappearance to you is, for them, the final step in a process that's been unfolding for a long time. And once that step is taken, it's rarely reversed, because the same awareness that led them to leave becomes the filter that prevents them from returning to what once diminished them. So when you think about emotional neglect, don't think of it as a single act. Think of it as a slow erosion, a gradual removal of value that doesn't trigger immediate alarms, but quietly dismantles the foundation of the relationship over time. And the moment that foundation collapses, the empath doesn't fight to rebuild it alone. They simply walk away, and this time, they don't look back. If emotional neglect is the slow erosion of a connection, betrayal is the moment the structure itself fractures. And for an empath, that fracture doesn't just create pain, it creates clarity. A kind of irreversible clarity that changes how they see you, how they interpret your behavior, and ultimately how they decide to move forward. Here's the part most people underestimate. Empaths don't trust casually. Their trust is layered. It's built through observation, emotional attunement, and repeated experiences of consistency. They notice the small things, tone shifts, inconsistencies, subtle contradictions, and yet, despite this heightened awareness, when they choose to trust you, they do it fully. Not halfway, not with one foot out the door, they invest. So when betrayal happens, whether it's dishonesty, disloyalty, manipulation, then we need to take a step back and assess the situation. Or even a violation of something unspoken but deeply understood, it doesn't register as a simple mistake. It registers as a collapse of the entire psychological model they built around you. And that's what makes it different. Most people experience betrayal as an event. Empaths experience it as a revelation. In that moment, it's not just about what you did. It is about what your actions reveal. It forces them to reevaluate every prior interaction, every moment of vulnerability, every time they gave you the benefit of the doubt. And once that reevaluation begins, it's very difficult to stop because the mind is now trying to reconcile two conflicting realities: who they believed you were and who your behavior has proven you to be. That internal conflict creates a specific kind of emotional intensity. But interestingly, empaths don't always express that intensity outwardly. In fact, many of them become quieter, more observant, more controlled, because they're no longer reacting, they're recalibrating. They're asking themselves a different set of questions now. Not how do I fix this, but what does this mean? Not how do we move forward, but is this someone I can ever feel safe with again? And safety is the key concept here. For an empath, trust is not just about honesty, it's about emotional safety. It's about knowing that the space they exist in with you is not going to be used against them. The moment betrayal enters the equation, that safety is compromised. And once safety is gone, the connection doesn't feel like a connection anymore. It feels like a risk. Now here's where it becomes psychologically precise. Empaths are often capable of forgiveness. They can understand context. They can empathize with why someone did what they did. They can even accept apologies and acknowledge growth. But forgiveness and access are not the same thing. This is where many people get confused. They assume that because the empath has forgiven them, the relationship can return to what it was. But what they fail to realize is that forgiveness happens internally. It's a way for the empath to release emotional weight, to avoid carrying resentment. It is not a decision to re-enter a dynamic that has already proven itself unstable. So externally, things may seem calm. There may not be conflict. There may not even be distance at first. But internally, something has shifted in a very definitive way. The empath is no longer relating to you from the same place. The emotional openness that once existed is now filtered, measured, guarded. And over time, that guardedness evolves into detachment. Not because they want to punish you, not because they're trying to make a statement, but because their internal system is prioritizing coherence. They cannot unknow what they now know. They cannot return to a state of trust that no longer aligns. With the evidence in front of them, there's also a deeper philosophical layer to this process. Empaths tend to operate with a strong internal alignment between values and behavior. When they encounter betrayal, it creates a misalignment not just between themselves and the other person, but between their values and the reality they're participating in. And that's not sustainable. Human beings can tolerate discomfort, but they struggle to tolerate contradiction over long periods of time. And for an empath, staying connected to someone who has violated their trust becomes a form of internal contradiction. It forces them to act against their own understanding of what is right, what is safe, what is true. So eventually something has to resolve. And when it does, it rarely comes with a dramatic announcement. It comes with a decision. A quiet, deliberate decision to step back, to reduce access, to stop investing at the level they once did. And in many cases, to remove themselves entirely. What makes this particularly difficult for the other person is that the empath may not explain it in a way that feels satisfying. There may not be a final conversation that provides closure, because from the empath's perspective, the defining moment already happened. The betrayal was the explanation. Everything that follows is just the consequence. And by the time that consequence becomes visible, by the time the distance is undeniable, the empath has already completed the internal process. They've already accepted the reality of who you are in their life. They've already adjusted their expectations. They've already let go of the version of the relationship that once existed. So what looks like a sudden withdrawal is actually the final stage of a very thorough internal evaluation. And once that evaluation is complete, there's a kind of finality to it, not driven by anger, but by certainty. The same depth that allowed them to trust you fully is now the same depth that prevents them from ignoring what they've learned, because once an empath sees the truth of a situation clearly, they don't negotiate with it. They align with it. And if that truth tells them that this connection is no longer safe, no longer honest, no longer real in the way it once was, then they don't fight to preserve it. They release it. And the most important thing to understand is this: you don't lose an empath when you make a mistake. You lose them when your actions force them to see you clearly. And what they see no longer matches what they can trust. If neglect is what slowly drains the connection, and betrayal is what fractures it, then being taken for granted is what exhausts it completely. It's not as sharp as betrayal, and not as quiet as neglect. It's something more deceptive. Because on the surface, everything can look stable. There's still communication. There's still interaction. There's still a connection. But underneath that, something critical is happening. The empath is being reduced to a function. They are no longer being experienced as a person. They are being experienced as a resource. And this shift is subtle. It doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself in patterns. The empath becomes the one you go to when you need support, but not the one you check in on. They become the one who listens, but not the one who is heard. They become the emotional anchor in moments of chaos, but when things are calm again, their presence becomes optional. At first, the empath doesn't resist this. In fact, it aligns with how they naturally operate. They are wired to give, to understand, to stabilize. There's a sense of purpose in being needed, but purpose without recognition eventually turns into depletion, because giving in its healthiest form requires acknowledgement, not constant praise, not performative gratitude, but a consistent awareness that what is being offered has value. When that awareness disappears, the act of giving begins to feel less like a choice, more like an expectation. And expectations, when left unspoken and unbalanced, create pressure. This is where the internal shift begins. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually. The empath starts to notice that their effort is no longer being met with appreciation, but with assumption. What they do is no longer seen as something meaningful, it's seen as something normal, something guaranteed. And that's a dangerous transition, because the moment something meaningful becomes expected, loses its emotional weight. It becomes invisible. And when a person's contributions become invisible, their sense of value within that dynamic starts to erode. Now here's where it becomes psychologically significant. Empaths are highly attuned to emotional reciprocity, not in a transactional way, but in a relational way. They understand that healthy dynamics involve a natural exchange of energy, attention, care, presence. When that exchange becomes one-sided, it creates an imbalance that the mind cannot ignore indefinitely. But instead of confronting it immediately, the empath often internalizes it first. They start asking themselves questions. Am I expecting too much? Is this just how relationships are? Maybe I should be more patient. And in doing so, they extend the dynamic longer than most people would. They give it time. They give it space. They give it more of themselves, hoping that something will recalibrate. But here's the reality. When someone is used to receiving, without acknowledging, they rarely recognize the imbalance on their own, because from their perspective, nothing feels wrong. Their needs are being met. The system is working for them. And this is where the empath reaches a critical realization. They begin to see that the connection is not mutual in the way they believed it was. That their presence is valued conditionally based on what they provide, not who they are. And once that realization becomes clear, something fundamental changes, because being needed is not the same as being valued. And empaths, at a certain point in their development, begin to understand that distinction with precision. This is where the emotional exhaustion sets in, not because they've given too much, but because what they've given has not been recognized in a way that sustains the connection. It's like speaking into a space that absorbs everything and reflects nothing back. Over time, that becomes unsustainable. So they begin to pull back, not out of resentment, but out of necessity. The energy they once gave freely is now being conserved. The constant availability becomes selective. The depth of their engagement becomes measured. And again, this is often misinterpreted. People assume the empath is becoming distant, less caring, less invested. But what's actually happening is far more precise. The empath is recalibrating their behavior to match the reality of the relationship. They are no longer overextending in a space that has not demonstrated the capacity to reciprocate. And this recalibration is not temporary, because once an empath sees that they've been taken for granted, they can't unsee it. The awareness reshapes their behavior permanently. They stop giving in ways that feel unacknowledged. They stop showing up in ways that feel one-sided. And in many cases, they stop showing up altogether. Not because they've stopped caring, but because they've started valuing themselves differently. There's also a philosophical dimension to this shift. At its core, being taken for granted is a violation of recognition. It's the absence of seeing. And for a human being, especially one who operates through emotional connection, being unseen is one of the most destabilizing experiences there is. Empaths, perhaps more than most, require a sense of being recognized not for validation, but for alignment. They need to know that their presence matters in a way that is acknowledged, not assumed. When that acknowledgement is missing, the connection loses its meaning. And when something loses its meaning, it becomes very easy to walk away from it. So by the time the empath begins to disappear, it's not a reaction. It's a resolution, a quiet decision to no longer participate in a dynamic that reduces them to a role instead of relating to them as a person. And what makes this so final is not the exhaustion itself, it's the clarity that comes with it. The understanding that they deserve to exist in spaces where their presence is not just useful but valued. Because once that understanding becomes internalized, it sets a new standard, and anything that falls below that standard is no longer something they try to fix, it's something they leave behind. And the truth is simple, even if it's uncomfortable. People don't walk away because they gave too much, they walk away because what they gave was never truly seen. If being taken for granted is what exhausts the empath, then the violation of boundaries is what ends. It not loudly, not dramatically, but with a kind of quiet finality that most people don't see coming until it's already done. Because here's the truth about boundaries when it comes to empaths. They're not always there in the beginning. Or if they are, they're flexible, adaptable. Empaths tend to prioritize harmony over control, connection over restriction. They give people room. They make allowances. They tolerate more than they should, not because they lack awareness, but because they believe in potential. They believe people can adjust, grow, and meet them halfway if given enough understanding. So early on, when a boundary is crossed, it's rarely enforced with rigidity. It's explained, sometimes softly, sometimes indirectly. The empath might express discomfort, but they often wrap it in empathy, trying to make sure the other person doesn't feel attacked or judged. They're not just communicating a limit, they're managing the emotional experience of the person hearing it. And this is where the pattern begins, because when a boundary is communicated without consequence, it becomes negotiable. And when it becomes negotiable, it gets tested. Not always intentionally, not always maliciously, but consistently. The line is crossed again, maybe in a slightly different way, maybe framed differently, maybe justified. And each time it happens, the empath adjusts. They explain again. They give context. They try to be clearer. They assume the misunderstanding is the issue, not the behavior itself. But over time, something becomes undeniable. It's not a misunderstanding. It's a disregard. And that realization changes everything. Because once an empath recognizes that their boundaries are not being misunderstood but ignored, the entire dynamic shifts from cooperative to misaligned. It's no longer about communication, it's about respect. And respect, unlike communication, is not something that can be negotiated into existence. It's demonstrated through behavior. Now here's where the psychological precision comes in. Empaths don't reach their limit quickly. They have a high tolerance for discomfort when they believe there is meaning behind it. But tolerance has a threshold, and that threshold is not defined by a single violation. It's defined by repetition without change. Each time a boundary is crossed, it leaves a mark, not always visible, not always expressed, but recorded. And just like with neglect and betrayal, the empath is observing patterns. They are tracking consistency. They are evaluating whether the behavior they're experiencing aligns with the words they're being given. And when those two things don't match, trust begins to erode in a very specific way, because a person who consistently crosses your boundaries is communicating something whether they say it or not. They're communicating that your limits are optional, that your comfort is secondary, that your needs are negotiable. And once that message is received clearly, the empath is faced with a decision, not an emotional decision, but a philosophical one. Do I continue to participate in a dynamic where my boundaries are not respected? Or do I align my actions with what I now understand to be true? And for a while, they may hesitate. They may try to salvage the connection. They may attempt one final clarification, one final conversation, one final effort to bridge the gap between intention and behavior. But if that effort is met with the same pattern dismissal, minimization, or temporary change followed by regression, then something very definitive happens. The empath stops explaining. And that's the moment everything shifts, because explanation is an investment. It's an attempt to bring someone into alignment with you. When that stops, it's not because the empath no longer cares, it's because they've recognized that further investment will not produce a different outcome. So instead of arguing, instead of defending, instead of trying to enforce the boundary, externally they enforce it internally. They create distance. Not as a tactic, not as a form of manipulation, but as a form of self-respect. They remove themselves from the environment where the boundary is being violated. They stop engaging in conversations that lead to the same outcome. They stop offering access to parts of themselves that have not been handled with care. And from the outside, this can feel abrupt, confusing even, because there's no escalation, no visible breaking point, just a shift from presence to absence. But internally, the process has been anything but sudden. It's been measured, observed, evaluated over time. And by the time the empath reaches this stage, they are no longer questioning their decision. They are aligning with it. There's also a deeper layer to this that often goes unrecognized. Boundaries are not just about protecting space, they're about defining identity. They communicate what a person will and will not accept as part of their experience. When those boundaries are consistently violated, it creates a form of internal conflict. A disconnect between who the empath knows themselves to be and what they are allowing in their environment. And that conflict cannot exist indefinitely. Eventually, something has to resolve. Either the empath lowers their standard and accepts the behavior, or they raise their behavior to match their standard and remove themselves from it. And when they choose the latter, it's not reactive. It's deliberate. It is the result of understanding that peace is not found in convincing others to respect your boundaries. It's found in refusing to stay where they are not respected. So when the empath disappears, it's not because they couldn't handle the situation. It's because they finally understood it. They understood that boundaries without consequences are just suggestions. They understood that respect cannot be requested repeatedly. It has to be demonstrated consistently. And most importantly, they understood that their presence is a privilege, not an obligation. And once that understanding becomes clear, there is nothing left to negotiate. Because the moment you have to fight to be respected is the moment the connection has already lost its foundation.